Hey everyone, welcome back. Are you ready to dive into some serious revolution talk today? We're focusing on a trio of world-changing events that, on the surface, might seem totally unrelated, but trust me, they have some seriously intertwined roots. We're going to be looking at the American Revolution kicking off in 1776, the French Revolution igniting in 1789, and even closer to home, Ireland's own rebellion in 1798.
It always fascinates me how these revolutions, though happening miles apart, we're all wrestling with such similar issues. It's almost like a textbook case of how frustration can simmer and then, boom, explode in surprisingly similar
Yeah,
ways.
it's wild. So let's talk about one major boiling point, dreaded taxes. It seems like almost every revolution has that tax frustration woven in, right?
Absolutely. And remember, we're not just talking about a few extra pennies in the government's coffers. It's about control. Who gets a say? Representation, and who has the power to make decisions that impact people's lives every single day.
Right, it's that feeling of being unheard. Okay, so picture this. It's the 1760s, and Britain's just strutting around, fresh off a victory in the French and Indian War, a war they fought in part to protect those American colonies, right? But victory parades are expensive, right? And guess whose celebration this ends up being?
Colonists, they get slapped with the bill.
Bingo. The colonists get the honor.
And it wasn't a small bill either. We're not talking about one tax, oh no. The Brits hit them with a whole combo, the Stamp Act, which meant a tax on every single piece of paper they used. Then comes the Quartering Act, forcing colonists to house British soldiers. And if that wasn't enough, they topped it off with the Townshend Acts, taxing everything from their tea to the paint they used in their homes. Talk about feeling the squeeze.
It's like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. You're a colonist, you have zero say in these laws, and now you can't even enjoy a simple cup of tea without being taxed for it. I mean, no wonder they were shouting, no taxation without representation. It's more than money. It's about having a voice, having a say in how you're governed.
Exactly. The colonists saw these taxes as a direct attack on their freedom, their right to govern themselves. But you've got to remember, the British were operating under this whole mercantilist system. They believed those colonies existed purely to benefit the mother country. They needed raw materials, and those colonies were a captive audience for their manufactured goods. That's where things like the Navigation Act come into play. The British essentially boxed them in, restricting their trade and limiting their economic options.
So it's this head-on collision of ideologies. Economic control versus individual freedom, right? And here's where it gets even more interesting. Across the pond, France was practically simmering with its own version of taxation without representation. Only it wasn't about colonies, it was about the very core of their society.
Right. You hit the nail on the head. In France, the whole burden of taxation fell squarely on the shoulders of the third state, basically. The everyday people, the commoners. They were the ones footing the bill for the extravagant lifestyle of the nobility and the clergy, who enjoyed life largely exempt from taxes. Can you imagine working your tail off, barely scraping by, while a select few lived in luxury, completely detached from the realities you faced every day?
Talk about a recipe for resentment, right? And let's break down these taxes a bit. You've got the tail, this land tax that could make or break a peasant family. Then you got the tithe, which meant a chunk of your income went straight to the church, whether you supported their practices or not. And if that wasn't enough, there's the gabelle, the salt tax. I don't know about you, but I need my salt. Back then, it wasn't just a seasoning. It was essential for preserving food. But in France, it was another way to squeeze money out of the common people. The crown set the price, and it was exorbitant.
And let's not forget the corvée, which was essentially forced labor. Peasants were obligated to work on public projects, like roads, for free. These weren't just minor inconveniences. They were burdens that kept people trapped in a cycle of poverty, unable to get ahead.
It's almost unbelievable how much the French peasantry was expected to endure. Just mind-boggling. And here's another layer to this whole thing. While the Americans were fired up by this sense of colonial injustice, the French had another powerful force at play: the Enlightenment.
Ah, yes, the Enlightenment. This wasn't just some abstract philosophy being debated in coffee houses. These were radical ideas about equality, about individual liberty, about what a government should and shouldn't do. Thinkers like Rousseau and Voltaire, their words, they were like little grenades being tossed into the establishment, questioning the entire foundation of the French monarchy, challenging their rigid social hierarchy. Their writings were basically contraband smuggled around, debated in secret, slowly chipping away at the authority of the old regime.
So you've got this pressure cooker of economic hardship and revolutionary ideas spreading like wildfire. It's the perfect storm.
And it wasn't just brewing in France. Across the Irish Sea, another group was watching, listening, taking notes, the Irish. They had their own issues with British rule, and their story was deeply tied to religion and land ownership.
Right, a whole other layer of complexity. So we're starting to see a pattern here. Unfair taxes, resentment bubbling under the surface, and this yearning for something more, something better. But how do these grievances actually erupt into full-blown rebellion?
It's like, it's one thing to feel the pressure, right? To see it, to know something's not right. But to actually stand up and say, no more, to challenge the whole system, that takes something else. That takes a spark.
Finding that tipping point, right? That flashpoint where frustration ignites. So in America's case, it seems like there was a whole chain of events pushing them closer and closer to that edge.
Oh, absolutely. You have this underlying tension, protests erupting, and then boom, March 5th, 1770. It's a late winter night in Boston, and things spiral. British soldiers, they're feeling threatened by this angry crowd, and they open fire. 5 colonists dead.
The Boston Massacre.
Exactly. The Boston Massacre. News spread like wildfire through the colonies. It was a turning point, a symbol of just how brutal British rule could be.
It's almost like that one event ripped away any pretense of peaceful coexistence. Suddenly, it wasn't just about taxes, it was about survival. About protecting themselves.
Exactly. And the British, even though they backed down on a few of those taxes, they tightened their grip in other ways, which just alienated the colonists even more. And then a few years later, bam, the Boston Tea Party. That's a whole other level of defiance.
Talk about making a statement. Colonists, disguised as Native Americans, dumping all that British tea into the harbor. What a visual.
It was a direct hit to the British economy, but it was more than that. It was symbolic. They were drawing a line in the sand.
And the British, of course, they don't just shrug it off.
Oh, no. They doubled down. They closed off Boston Harbor, imposed even stricter controls. They essentially backed the colonists into a corner, leaving them with almost no room to maneuver.
And that brings us to the inevitable, I guess. April 19th, 1775, Lexington and Concord.
The shot heard around the world.
The start of the American Revolution. I mean, when you really think about it, it's remarkable. This group of essentially citizen soldiers, farmers, shopkeepers going up against the might of the British Empire.
It seemed unwinnable. A true David and Goliath situation. And yet here we are.
And this is where George Washington enters the scene. He's about to become the face of the American Revolution.
And he was an interesting choice for commander. It's not like he was some military prodigy. But he had this presence, this ability to inspire. He believed in the cause, and people were drawn to that.
And let's not forget, he wasn't just some detached general. He was a wealthy landowner himself. He had skin in the game, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. He understood the stakes personally. And his ability to unite those colonies, to bring them together under a common goal, that was his genius. And of course, we can't forget the impact of France.
Right, France, seeing an opportunity to stick it to their rivals.
Exactly. They saw a chance to weaken the British Empire, and they took it. The support they provided, both militarily and financially, it was crucial for the American victory. And then in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia, it all came to a head. The combined French and American forces trapped the British army, leading to, well, a very decisive surrender.
A ragtag group of colonists, with a little help from some friends across the pond, managed to defeat a global superpower. It's an incredible story.
It really is. And just a few years later, those friends in France, they have their own revolution to deal with. But unlike the American story, this one takes a much darker, more complicated turn.
Their spark, though, it involves a very different kind of symbol, the Bastille.
Ah, yes. The Bastille, July 14th, 1789. This Parisian mob, fueled by years of resentment, by hunger, by those Enlightenment ideals we talked about, they stormed the Bastille, the symbol of royal authority. It was like this pressure valve finally bursting.
And it wasn't just about tearing down a building, it was about dismantling the whole system.
Exactly. And in the aftermath of the Bastille's fall, you see the rise of the National Assembly, formed largely by members of the Third Estate. They were determined to create a new France, one built on those revolutionary principles: liberty, equality, fraternity.
And this is where we get the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This document, it wasn't just a French thing. It had reverberations throughout Europe and beyond. It's a powerful statement proclaiming that all men have inherent rights, regardless of their social standing.
It was truly revolutionary. Here you have a nation once ruled by absolute monarchs saying, power to the people, The idea that a government's legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed, that was radical, that was profound.
It's really remarkable. And while all of this is happening across the Irish Sea, there's this young lawyer, Theobald Wolfe Tone, who's watching these revolutions unfold with a keen eye.
Wolfe Tone, now there's a visionary. He saw what was happening in America and France, and he believed with every fiber of his being that Ireland could be free too. He was a fierce advocate for Irish independence.
He saw those revolutions and thought, we can do that too.
Exactly. He understood the power of those ideas, and he wanted to harness that energy for Ireland. In 1791, he founded the Society of United Irishmen, and his goal was ambitious, to say the least, to unite Catholics and Protestants under this banner of an independent Irish republic.
Two groups with, let's say, complicated history. That's quite the challenge.
It was a monumental task. And while the United Irishmen, they gained a lot of support, especially among the disenfranchised Catholics, they also faced, well, a lot of pushback.
It wasn't going to be easy.
The British, they weren't just going to sit back and watch this unfold. They were worried, and they cracked down hard on the United Irishmen, driving them underground. So we've got three revolutions, each at a different stage, each facing its own set of obstacles, its own dangers.
It's like, okay, you've thrown the tea in the harbor, you've stormed the Bastille, you've made your declaration. But then what? Actually changing the world is a whole other ballgame, right?
Absolutely, and it's rarely a clean break, is it? Revolutions, they're messy, they're unpredictable, full of twists and turns you never see coming. And we have to remember, they don't happen in isolation. Think about it. These three revolutions were unfolding while the whole European power structure was shifting, alliances were changing, and the world was on the brink of massive upheaval.
Right. These weren't just isolated incidents. The stakes were incredibly high. But let's bring it back to America for a second. They declared independence, but now they have to actually win a war against, well, one of the world's most powerful empires at the time.
It was a long shot, for sure. The American Revolution was a brutal 8-year slog. Both sides had their victories, their losses, their share of heartbreak. But there's a turning point, a game changer, and it happens at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777.
What happens there?
The Americans, they secure a decisive victory. And it wasn't just any victory, it was a signal, a message to the rest of the world that these Americans, they were a force to be reckoned with.
Enough to make France sit up and take notice.
Oh, absolutely. That's the turning point. France, on the verge of its own revolution, decides to formally ally with the Americans. They provide much-needed troops, supplies, money, essentially. They go all in.
So France, dealing with its own internal struggles, decides to back this risky rebellion across the ocean. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
And it pays off. In 1781, at Yorktown, Virginia, the combined French and American forces, they trapped the British Army. It's a decisive victory for the Americans, essentially securing their independence.
It's hard to overstate how significant that is. This brand new nation, with some help from their French friends, they managed to defeat a global empire. It's a story for the ages.
And it sent shockwaves through the world. Here was a blueprint, a model for throwing off the shackles of colonial rule, for establishing a government based on the will of the people.
It's inspiring, even now.
Absolutely. But then, a few years later, France has its own revolution to contend with, and it's a very different story, a much more turbulent and, frankly, brutal affair.
Things in France really took a dark turn.
They did. While the American Revolution had its share of conflict, of course, the French Revolution was, well, it was different. The execution of Louis VI in 1793, that was a pivotal moment. Here was a king beheaded by his own people. It was shocking, even to some who supported the revolution.
It set a chilling precedent.
It did. It ushered in the reign of terror under Robespierre.
This is where things get really, really intense. The reign of terror, it's this period of extreme paranoia, political violence, mass executions. It's a dark chapter.
It is. Anyone perceived as an enemy of the revolution, even based on the flimsiest of accusations, they could be sent to the guillotine. It's a sobering reminder that even with the best of intentions, revolutions can go terribly wrong.
It's a cautionary tale for sure. And sadly, across the Irish Sea, the fight for Irish independence, it faced its own share of tragedy.
It did. The Irish Rebellion of 1798, it had that same spark of revolution, but ultimately it ended in defeat. Despite some early victories like the Wexford Rebellion, the United Irishmen, they were simply outmatched by the British forces.
And Wolfe Tone, the man who dared to dream of a free Ireland, what happened to him?
Tone, after a failed attempt to secure additional support from France, he was captured by British forces and sentenced to death. He died in prison at the age of 35, becoming a martyr for the cause of Irish independence.
A tragic end to a life dedicated to fighting for freedom. It's a reminder that revolutions are not for the faint of heart. They demand sacrifice.
They do. And while there's always a human cost, a price to be paid, these revolutions, they leave an indelible mark. They plant seeds of change. They inspire future generations to fight for what they believe in.
So how do we even begin to sum up the impact of these three revolutions? They're so different and yet so deeply intertwined.
They are. The American Revolution, although it wasn't perfect, it gave birth to a new kind of nation, a new model for democratic governance. The French Revolution, for all its complexities and tragedies, it shattered the old feudal system, and those ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, they resonated throughout Europe and beyond. And the Irish Rebellion, even though it didn't achieve its immediate goals, it helped to solidify a sense of Irish identity, a yearning for self-determination that would fuel future struggles for independence.
Like each revolution nudged the world forward in its own way, challenging the status quo, leaving behind a legacy that we're still grappling with today.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to look at these events together, to see the parallels, the divergences, the ripple effects. History isn't linear. It's messy and interconnected, and it's still being written.
And that's where we leave it, folks. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the revolutions that shaped our world. Until next time, keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep learning.